Hello, my name is Ian and I am a tutor at Chegg. Today we are going to be talking about the Keynesian economic view. I think it's important to let you guys know we will be referencing the classical view as this graph on the left suggests. So I will be glossing over what the classical view is to compare it to the Keynesian view to help with understanding, but I'm not going to be going in detail about the classical view. So Keynesian economics has two key points, and I will be referring back to the graph as I explain the first point in particular. Unlike in classical economics, the Keynesian SRAS, the short-run aggregate supply curve, is upward sloping, and therefore shifts in the aggregate demand curve affect aggregate output and unemployment as well as aggregate prices. So that's super wordy. What the heck does that mean? So in microeconomics, you might have remembered how demand and supply curves shift. That's essentially what's going on here. So this graph to the right, this is your Keynesian view. We initially start with this first price here at equilibrium 1, and then for some reason, prices go down, perhaps something like the 2008 stock market crash that caused people to reduce spending. So our prices go down. And because our prices go down, our real GDP or our output, they're the same thing, also goes down. This is different than the classical view because as you can see with this graph here, the short run aggregate supply curve is perfectly inelastic. So that's how you have only your price effect, but no quantity effect. This here is your quantity effect, and this here is your price effect. Here, the output, the quantity, it does not change, but you can see that the price changes here. So that is essentially what the first bullet point means. The second key point is while classical economists emphasize the role of changes in the money supply as the main factor that shifts the aggregate demand curve, while ignoring most other factors, Keynesian economists argue that animal spirit, also known as business confidence, is what really causes business cycles. So this again is really wordy, but if your professor were to ask you these questions on the exam, the first one would be to remember that the Keynesian short-run aggregate supply looks just like a not perfectly elastic and not perfectly inelastic supply curve. So it looks like your standard, just draw it as it is supply curve, upward sloping. And because it is upward sloping, any shift in the price or in the output will affect the other one as well. For the second bullet point, the last sentence is really the most important thing to remember. That animal spirit, also known as a business confidence, is what really causes business cycles. So I know when I went through my intro to macro class, as well as some of my intermediate macro class, I had a hard time remembering what aggregate meant. None of my professors actually told us flat out what aggregate meant. It was implied, but it was never actually stated. So in case that's been the situation with you as well, aggregate is the collective amount or sum that is created by adding all components, elements, or parts of an assembly or group without trying to say that the total is whole or contains everything relevant that should be included. And this is because whenever you're making anything that's aggregate, especially in the real world, there's no way to ever include everything. So even when you calculate aggregate anything in the real world, there is something that is probably left out. Therefore, it is a simplification. So just so that you can keep up with some of the words I will be using and have used so far, I'm now going to go over some of the terms I have said so far. So the aggregate demand curve, which is these blue or downward sloping lines here and here, show the relationship between aggregate price level and the quantity of aggregate output that is demanded by households, businesses, the government, and the rest of the world. So if you can remember the general relationship in microeconomics for the demand curve, it's very similar here, except it's based off of what the axes are. So your aggregate price level will typically be on the y-axis, similar to how prices were usually on the y-axis in microeconomics. So what does that mean? The aggregate price level is a measure of the overall level of prices in the economy. So how high are they? How low are they? That's basically what it means. As in general, even though there will be fluctuations, it's in general. So aggregate output is essentially real gross domestic product. Real GDP is basically the numerical measurement of this. So if you remember what real gross domestic product is the economy's total production of final goods and services for a given time period, usually a year. So I'm going to shrink myself so that you can see what's going on here. But in the event you don't remember how gross domestic product is calculated, GDP, which is your Y or output, which is why Y is on the bottom here, as well as the bottom of the Keynesian graph, it is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. And your professor may also have these two terms written as NX, which is really just what X minus, or exports minus imports is. And then the business confidence or animal spirit is how confident households and businesses are about the general health of the economy. For example, right now, people are not too confident with the economy ever since the crash we had in 2008. Therefore, we have a low animal spirit or low business confidence since many people are not investing. So the last thing I think is important to touch on is what were the consequences of Keynesian economic policy. Basically, it's this thing called macroeconomic policy activism, and that is the use of monetary and fiscal policy to smooth out the business cycle. In the past, there was macroeconomic policy activism, especially around the time of the Great Depression. It just wasn't legitimized until Keynes came and wrote the general theory, because mostly due to how the classical view saw things. So if your professor asks you what the consequences of Keynesian economic policy are, that is what you would say. Macroeconomic policy activism was legitimized, and it is the use of monetary and fiscal policy to smooth out the business cycle. So to sum up everything we went through, the classical view says that in the short run, if prices change, that will have no effect on our real GDP or our aggregate output. However, Keynes, he argued that a change in our aggregate price level will also change our real GDP or our aggregate output. I hope this tutorial was helpful for you to understand the Keynesian view today, and perhaps strengthened how well you knew the classical view as well.